The spear point stopped a hand's width from Owen Morgan's throat, close enough that he could feel the cold of the iron on his skin, and behind it stood the largest woman he had ever seen in his life, her tusks catching the torchlight like ivory knives. "Kneel, wagon man," she said, her voice a low growl that carried over the crackle of the settlers' fires, "or I will make your people carry you home in pieces." Owen did not kneel. His knees wanted to, badly, but some stubborn thing in his chest kept him upright. His hands raised slow and empty at his sides, while 30 families who had trusted him to bring them safely across 400 miles of hard country watched from behind wagon wheels and half-built fences, too frightened to move. Behind the orc woman stood a dozen warriors in hide and bronze, torches held high, and behind them the black shapes of the cliffs that dropped away into the churning sea of Saltmere Cove, the harbor his settlers had spent 3 weeks clearing of driftwood and building docks upon, the harbor that apparently already belonged to someone else. "I don't kneel to spears pointed at my throat," Owen said, and his voice, to his own surprise, came out steady. "Never have. Seems like a poor way to start a conversation." The orc woman's yellow eyes narrowed. She was clad in fitted travel leathers the color of dark rust, laced tight across a powerful frame, a leather cuirass molded to her form and worked with bone rings at the shoulder that marked, he would later learn, a champion's rank. Her black hair was pulled back in a braid thick as a ship's rope, and a scar ran pale through one eyebrow. She was, Owen thought distantly, even with a spear at his throat, the most striking creature he had ever laid eyes on, and he hated that his mind found room to notice it in the middle of what was very likely his own death. "I am Shagrol Bonecrusher," she said, "champion of the Stonetide clan, sent by Chief Gorath Ironjaw to tell you that this cove belongs to my people, that the reef you have fouled with your nets belongs to my people, and that you and every soul behind you have 3 days to load your wagons and go back over the mountains the way you came." She let the spear drift a fraction closer. "That is the message. I was told to make certain you understood it." "I understand it fine," Owen said. "I just don't believe you came 4 leagues in the dark with a dozen warriors only to tell me a thing you could have shouted from the tree line." Something flickered behind her eyes, gone as quick as it came. Around them the settlers had gone utterly silent, even the babies hushed against their mothers' shoulders, even the dogs gone still. Owen was aware of every one of them watching him, aware that whatever he did in the next few breaths would decide whether Saltmere Cove became a home or a grave. "You are either very brave or very stupid, wagon man," Shagrol said. "I've been called both," Owen said, usually in the same sentence. He let his empty hands fall slowly to his sides, and then, because his mother had raised him to never let a guest stand cold at his door, even if that guest was pointing a spear at him, he turned deliberately away from the point of it and walked to the low fire where a cask of cider sat warming on its stand, the one thing his people had managed to brew from the wild apples along the coast road. He heard the intake of breath from the settlers behind him, heard someone hiss his name in warning, felt rather than saw Shagrol's spear track him like a hawk's eye. He poured a cup, the good cup, the tin one without the dent, and turned back to her, holding it out. "You rode hard to get here before dark," he said. "Long ride deserves a warm cup, even if you mean to run me through after you drink it." For 3 full heartbeats, Shagrol Bonecrusher, champion of the Stonetide clan, said nothing at all. Her spear did not lower. Her warriors shifted uneasily behind her, murmuring in their own tongue, clearly as baffled as the settlers by what was happening. She looked at the cup in his outstretched hand, then at his face, searching it for the mockery she must have expected to find there, and found, instead, only a tired, weathered, entirely sincere man offering her cider like she was a neighbor come in from the rain. She began, and stopped. She had rehearsed this. Owen would learn much later, once she trusted him enough to admit it, that she had rehearsed the whole speech on the ride down from the clan camp, the threats, the ultimatum, the cold warning about what happened to trespassers who did not heed the Stonetide clan's first mercy. She had said it to the wind and to her horse and to the dark shapes of the sea stacks along the cliff road, and she had it perfect, every word honed like a blade. She had not rehearsed for Cider. "I did not come here to drink with you," she finally said, but the words came out strange off their rhythm, and she heard it herself, heard how they did not land the way a champion's words were meant to land, and her ears went hot beneath her braid. "No," Owen agreed easily. "You came here to threaten me. I heard you the first time, but there's no rule I know of that says a man can't threaten a fellow over a warm drink instead of a cold one. Go on, finish your speech. I'll wait." He kept the cup extended, steady, patient, as if he had all the time in the world and nowhere else on earth he needed to be. Shagrol's spear wavered just slightly, just enough that Owen noticed, and one of the warriors behind her, an older orc with gray threading his tusks, made a small sound that might have been a stifled laugh. "You mock me," she said. "I don't," Owen said. "I've got 30 families behind me who walked out of everything they knew because the last patch of ground they worked couldn't feed them anymore. I'm not fool enough to mock the one holding a spear to my throat. I'm just offering you a drink because you look tired, and because whatever happens next, it'll happen better on a full cup than an empty one." She lowered the spear. She did not mean to. Owen would swear later that he watched the decision surprise her as much as it surprised everyone else, watched her arm move as though some current beneath her own will had pulled it down, and then the spear point was pointed at the dirt instead of his throat, and she was reaching out, slow, wary, as if the cup might bite her, and she took it from his hand. Her fingers brushed his. Neither of them would speak of how long that touch lasted, though it could not have been more than a heartbeat, but Owen felt it travel up his arm like a spark jumping a gap, and he saw something answering flare in Shagrol's yellow eyes before she mastered it and looked away, down into the cup, down at the pale gold cider steaming faintly in the cold sea air. She drank. "It is," she said slowly, as if the words cost her something, "not terrible." "High praise," Owen said, and something in his chest, some tight and frightened thing that had been coiled there since the torches first appeared on the cliff road, eased just slightly. Shagrol looked up at him over the rim of the cup, and for one unguarded moment her whole face changed, the fierce lines of the champion's mask softening into something almost bewildered, almost young. Then her jaw set again, hard, and she thrust the empty cup back into his hands as if it had burned her. 3 days, she said, and her voice had found its edge again, though it was a near thing. 3 days, Wagon Man, and then Chief Gorath sends more than his champion to deliver his message. She turned on her heel, and her warriors turned with her, torches bobbing away up the dark cliff road, and it was not until the last of them had vanished into the tree line that Owen realized his hands were shaking. Behind him, the settlers exhaled as one, a great collective breath held too long, and someone began to weep with relief, and someone else was already shouting that they should have shot the whole lot of them when they had torches lit and clear as targets, and Owen turned to find Elder Bramwell, white-haired and grim, standing at his shoulder. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever watched a man do," Bramwell said, "or you've doomed us all with cider." "Maybe both," Owen said, and looked up the dark road where the torches had gone, and found he could not stop thinking of the way her fingers had felt against his, or the way her face had softened, just for a moment, over a cup of cheap cider by a dying fire. 3 days, she had said. He did not have 3 days' worth of a plan. What he had was a half-built harbor, 30 frightened families, an orc clan that had every right to be furious, and the growing, unwelcome, entirely inconvenient certainty that he had just handed his heart to a woman who could have snapped his neck like a dry twig. The next morning, Owen walked the harbor line with Elder Bramwell and 2 of the settlement's fishermen, surveying the docks his people had raised from driftwood and salvaged ship timber, the nets already strung along the tide pools where the water ran silver with herring. It was, he had to admit, a fine harbor, tucked into a horseshoe of black rock that broke the worst of the Atlantic swells, with a deep-water channel that would take real ships once they'd built a proper quay. He understood, walking it in the cold morning light, exactly why the orcs did not want to give it up, and he understood with the same clarity that his own people had nowhere else to go. The land grant from the crown had promised them this cove specifically, on maps drawn by men who had never set foot within 100 miles of the place, men who had certainly never asked whether an orc clan had fished these waters for 3 centuries before the ink dried. "We could bring in more men," said one of the fishermen, a broad-shouldered man named Silas Crane who had signed on to the wagon train back in the valley towns, promising strong hands and a willingness to work. "Send word back along the trail. There's a garrison 2 weeks east that owes the crown its keep. Let them handle a pack of greenskins." 2 weeks is a long time to wait with a spear already at our throats, Owen said. "And I won't have this cove built on a battlefield, Silas. Not while there's another way." "And what other way is that?" Silas asked, an edge in his voice that Owen filed away for later thought. "You going to pour the whole clan cider until they forget why they came?" Owen did not answer that, mostly because he did not have an answer, and he spent the rest of that day and the next turning the problem over in his mind like a stone. He could not skip properly across the water. On the evening of the second day, word came up from the tide line that a small orc delegation waited at the boundary stones the settlers had driven at the edge of the cove, and Owen went down alone, against Bramwell's protests, to meet them. It was not Shagrol who waited, but the older gray-tusked warrior who had stood behind her that first night, and he carried no spear, only a folded hide marked with charcoal lines that Owen realized on closer look was a map. "Chief Gorath sends word," the old warrior said in careful, heavily accented trade tongue. "He does not wish for a war he did not choose, but the reef is sacred to us. Our dead are woven into its currents. We will not surrender it. Neither will my people surrender the only home the crown gave them," Owen said. "Is there no middle ground, a share of the water, a treaty on the fishing rights, season split between us?" The old warrior studied him for a long moment. "There is an old way," he said slowly, "older than your crown, older than our chief's grandfather. When 2 peoples cannot agree on land and neither will yield and neither wishes for war, there is a binding. A claim bond, sealed in blood, between one of yours and one of ours. It ties both peoples together so that harming one wounds the other. It has not been used in 3 generations, but it is still law among the clans." Owen felt something cold settle in his stomach. "A binding," he repeated. "You mean a marriage." "A claiming," the old warrior corrected. "More binding than your human vows. Once sealed, it cannot be undone but by death. Chief Gorath offers this instead of war if your leader will provide a man willing to be claimed, and if our champion will consent to claim him." "Your champion," Owen said, though he already knew with a lurching certainty exactly whom the old warrior meant. "Shagrol Bonecrusher failed to drive you off with words," the old warrior said, and there was something almost like sympathy in his weathered face. "Chief Gorath is not a patient man. He has decided that if she could not frighten you away, she will bind you instead and end the dispute that way. It is, in its way, an honor, and a punishment, for her at least." Owen thought of the way Shagrol's fingers had trembled just slightly when they brushed his over the cup of cider, of the way her whole fierce composure had cracked open for one unguarded heartbeat, and something in him, something reckless and hopeful and entirely un-wagon-master-like, said yes before his better sense could catch up. "I'll need to speak with her first," Owen said. "Not the chief, her." The old warrior's tusked mouth curved in something that might have been the ghost of a smile. "She said you would say that," he said. "She is waiting at the boundary stones if you have the nerve to walk to them." Shagrol was waiting exactly where the old warrior said she would be, standing at the weathered gray stones that marked the edge of contested ground, her arms crossed, her jaw set in a hard line that did not quite hide the tension beneath it. She had changed nothing of her dress since the night at the fire, the same fitted rust-leather travel gear laced tight across her powerful frame, though now in the fading daylight Owen could see the fine details he had missed in torchlight. The bone rings at her shoulder marking her rank, A thin braided cord at her wrist that he would later learn was a mourning token for a fallen kinsman, the careful, deliberate way she held herself like a drawn bow. "You heard, then," she said, without preamble when he was close enough. "I heard," Owen said. "Your chief wants us bound to keep the peace." "My chief," Shagrol said, and there was real bitterness in it now, "wants to remind me that I failed to frighten you off and thinks this a fitting punishment. To chain his champion to a wagon-driving human for the rest of her days." She looked at him then, really looked, and Owen made himself hold her gaze, though it took more courage than the spear at his throat ever had. "Do not mistake this for anything but what it is, Owen Morgan. It is a treaty. It is not a courtship." "I know what a treaty is," Owen said quietly. "I've watched enough of them get signed and broken to know the difference between paper and people. But I also know that if I say no, my settlers likely die on this coast within the season, one way or another, whether by your chief's spears or by starving on land that isn't theirs to farm. So I'll say yes, Shagrol Bonecrusher, not because I'm afraid of you." He paused, and something honest and unplanned came out of him before he could stop it. "Though I am a little, because you're the strongest thing I've ever stood in front of, but mostly because it's the only door I can see that doesn't end in graves." Shagrol's eyes stayed on his face for a long moment, unreadable, and when she spoke again her voice had lost some of its hard edge, gone rough instead, almost raw. "You should be afraid of more than my spear," she said. "A claim bond is not a piece of paper your crown can tear up when it suits you. It is blood and oath, and once it is sealed, I will not let you go, wagon man, whatever either of us comes to feel about it. My people do not undo what has been bound." "Then we'd best both go into it with our eyes open," Owen said, "and figure out the feeling part as we go." That night, the old warrior returned to the settlement to tell Elder Bramwell what had been decided, and while half the settlers rejoiced at the promise of peace, Silas Crane's face, Owen noticed from across the fire, had gone tight and pale with something that was not relief at all. The claim bond was sealed 3 mornings later on the flat black rocks above the tide line, with both peoples gathered in uneasy proximity along the boundary stones, orc warriors on one side in their hides and bronze, settlers on the other in homespun and wool, the gray sea churning below them and gulls wheeling overhead as though even the birds had come to watch. Chief Goreth Ironjaw himself presided, a mountain of an orc with a jaw like a plow blade and eyes that missed nothing, and beside him stood Shagrol, dressed still in her fitted travel leathers, her chin high, her spine straight as a mast, giving away nothing of what she felt to the watching crowd. Owen stood across from her on the flat stone, feeling every eye on the coast fixed upon him, feeling Silas Crane's stare boring into his back like a blade, and when Goreth drew a curved bone knife and beckoned them both forward, Owen did not flinch. "Give your hand, wagon man," Goreth rumbled, "if you mean this." Owen held out his palm. The knife was quick and cold, a single clean line across his skin, and he heard, rather than saw, Shagrol do the same, a small hiss of breath as the blade opened her own palm. Goreth pressed their hands together, blood to blood, and spoke words in the old tongue that Owen did not understand but felt anyway, deep in his chest, like a bell struck once and left to ring. "By blood and salt," Goreth finished, this time in trade tongue for the human's benefit, "the Stonetide clan claims kinship with the man Owen Morgan, and the man Owen Morgan is claimed by the champion Shagrol Bonecrusher, and what harms one now harms both, and what land is disputed between them is disputed no longer, for it belongs now to a bond neither side can break without breaking itself." The crowd was silent. Then from somewhere among the settlers, a voice Owen was almost certain it was Silas muttered something about abomination, and a ripple of unease moved through the human side of the boundary line, but Elder Bramwell stepped forward before it could grow into more than a murmur. "Peace," Bramwell said, loud enough to carry. "We have peace, and that is worth more than pride." Owen looked down at his hand, still pressed to Shagrol's, blood mingling in the crease of their palms, and looked up to find her watching him with an expression he could not name, fierce and wary, and something else beneath it, something that looked almost like fear, though he could not imagine what a champion of the Stone-Tide clan had left to be afraid of. "It's done, then," he said softly, for her ears only. "It is done," she agreed, and pulled her hand free, and if her fingers lingered a moment longer than necessary against his, neither of them spoke of it. The days that followed were not easy ones. Shagrol moved into the small timber house Owen had built for himself at the edge of the settlement, a modest place with a stone hearth and one good window facing the harbor, and the arrangement suited neither of them at first. She took the floor by the hearth rather than share the narrow bed, arms crossed, tusks bared at nothing in particular, and Owen slept badly knowing she lay so near and so unreachable, a wall of pride and unfamiliarity between them thicker than any timber. "You don't have to sleep on the floor," he told her the third night, exasperated, after listening to her shift restlessly for an hour. "It's my house. I can sleep on the floor just as easily." "I am not delicate, wagon man," she said, "and I do not need your charity." "It isn't charity," Owen said. "It's manners. There's a difference." "There is no difference where I come from," Shagrol said, but he heard something almost like amusement under the words, and the next night, without comment, she took the bed and he took the floor, and neither of them mentioned it again, though Owen noticed she left him the better blanket. They learned each other slowly, in the small ways that mattered more than either of them expected. She learned that he hummed old trail songs under his breath while mending harness leather, tuneless and off-key, and that he always saved the crust of the bread for last because his mother had taught him crusts were the best part and shouldn't be wasted first. He learned that she sharpened her twin hand axes every night without fail, a ritual as much as a practical habit, and that she flinched, just slightly, at loud, unexpected noises in a way that spoke of old battles he did not ask about yet, and that when she thought no one was watching she would stand at the window and look out at the harbor with an expression of such fierce longing that it made his chest ache. "You miss the reef," he said to her one evening when he caught her at the window for the third night running. "I miss knowing my place in the world," she said, before she seemed to realize how much that admitted, and closed her mouth hard, tusks pressing into her lower lip. "You could still fish it," Owen said. "Nothing in the bond says you can't. The reef's meant to be shared now, isn't it? That was the whole point." Shagrol looked at him for a long moment. "You would not mind," she said slowly, "your wife hauling nets like a common fisherwoman instead of sitting proper by your hearth, the way your human women do." Owen almost laughed but caught himself, because her question was not really a joke. "Shagrol," he said, "I've watched you break a spear haft over your knee for kindling because it was raining too hard to go find dry wood. I don't think there's a hearth in the world proper enough to keep you in it if you didn't want to be there. I married a champion, not a house cat." Something in her face cracked open then, just slightly, the ghost of a real smile breaking through the guarded lines, and it undid something in Owen's chest that he had not known was tied so tight. "Tomorrow, then," she said, "I will show you how a Stone-Tide woman fishes." She did, and it became, in the weeks that followed, one of the few true pleasures of their strange arrangement. Shagrol out on the tide flats at dawn with her nets and her sure, powerful hands, hauling in herring and crab faster than any three settlers combined, while Owen worked the harbor's growing quay alongside the village men, and in the evenings they would eat together at the small table by the hearth, and slowly, so slowly neither of them marked the exact day it happened, the silence between them stopped being awkward and started being comfortable, and then, somewhere past comfortable, it started being something that hummed. It was on one such evening, 6 weeks into the bond, that the push and pull between them finally caught fire. Owen had come in soaked to the skin from repairing a storm-damaged dock piling, cursing under his breath, and Shagrol had laughed at him, actually laughed, a real full-throated sound he had not heard from her before, and something about the unguarded delight on her face undid the last of his careful restraint. "Go on, laugh," he said, dripping on the floorboards. See if I share the fire with you tonight. You would freeze me out of my own hearth, Shagrol said, rising from her seat, still grinning, tusks bright in the firelight. Bold words for a man who cannot even keep his footing on wet wood. I kept my footing fine, Owen said. It was the piling that gave out, not me. Shagrol said, stepping closer, close enough now that Owen had to tip his head back slightly to hold her gaze, close enough that he could feel the heat coming off her skin, smell wood smoke and salt and something warmer underneath. And yet here you stand, dripping like a drowned dog, while I remain dry and victorious. Victorious over what exactly? Over you, she said, and her voice had dropped, gone rough and low in a way that sent heat straight through him, and her hand came up, slow, deliberate, and closed around the collar of his soaked shirt. I have been thinking, wagon man, that this bond of ours has gone 6 weeks without either of us admitting the truth of it. And what truth is that? Owen managed, though his own pulse was hammering hard enough that he was fairly certain she could hear it. That I did not lower my spear that first night because you offered me cider, Shagrol said. I lowered it because when you looked at me, you were not afraid of what I am. You were only afraid of what might happen to your people. That is a rare thing, Owen Morgan. I have had men afraid of me my whole life. I have had none look at me and see only a woman worth pouring a drink for. You're a hard woman to stop thinking about, Owen admitted, low, spear or no spear. Her grip on his collar tightened, pulled him the last inch closer, and then her mouth was on his, fierce and certain and hungry, tasting of salt and cider and something fiercely, wonderfully alive, and Owen's hands came up to her waist, to the laces of her leather bodice, and for a long, breathless moment there was no bond, no treaty, no clan and no crown, only the two of them and the fire and 6 weeks of careful distance burning away like morning mist. She broke away first, breathing hard, forehead pressed to his, her eyes bright and fierce and for once entirely unguarded. That, she said, was not part of the treaty. No, Owen agreed. It wasn't. And he kissed her again, and this time neither of them pulled away for a long, long while, and the storm outside beat against the little timber house. And inside, for the first time since the boundary stones and the bone knife, it felt like something had truly begun. But peace, as Owen would learn, is a fragile thing to build a life upon, especially when there are men who profit from its failure. It was Sela's crane who broke it, 3 weeks after that night by the fire, though Owen would not learn the full truth of it until later. Sela's had come west with dreams of owning the harbor outright, of controlling the fish trade to the garrison towns, and taking a merchant's cut off every barrel that left the cove, dreams that a shared treaty with the orcs made impossible. He had been quietly gathering a handful of discontented settlers for weeks, men who resented Shagrol's presence, who muttered about abominations and unnatural bonds, who had never wanted peace so much as they wanted the reef to themselves. On a moonless night in early autumn, Sela's and 4 other men crept down to the tide flats and cut the orc fishing weirs to pieces, fouled the nets with rocks and rot, and in their retreat were spotted by a young stone-tide scout who raised the alarm. What followed was not war, not quite, but it was close enough to taste. Torches on both sides of the boundary stones before dawn, spears and axes drawn, shouted accusations flying across the tide line, and Owen woke to Shagrol already dressed and armed, her twin-hand axes at her belt, fury blazing in her yellow eyes. They have broken the bond, she said, or as good as. Goreth will demand blood for this. Not if we can prove who did it before he acts, Owen said, pulling on his boots. Shagrol, wait, but she was already out the door, and Owen ran after her into the gray pre-dawn light, down toward the boundary stones where both peoples had gathered in a taut, furious knot, torches and weapons raised, one spark away from a slaughter that would undo everything the claim bond had built. He pushed through the crowd, ignoring the hands that grabbed at his sleeve, until he stood between the 2 lines, between Shagrol's raised axe and a young stone-tide warrior's spear on one side, and Sela's crane's rifle-armed friends on the other. Stop! Owen shouted, and something in his voice, raw and desperate and entirely unlike the calm wagon-master's tone the settlers knew, made even the angriest of them pause. "Nobody raises a hand until we know the truth of what happened tonight." "The truth is plain enough," snarled one of the orc warriors. "Your people cut our weirs." "Then let's prove it," Owen said, "instead of killing each other over a guess." He turned, searching the crowd, and found Silas near the back, trying to slip away into the dark, and something in the man's face, guilty and pale, told Owen everything he needed to know. "Silas Crane, where were you an hour past?" "Asleep in my bed, same as any decent man," Silas said, too quickly. "Search his boots," Shagrol said, low and dangerous, stepping up beside Owen, her axe still raised but her eyes fixed now on Silas rather than the orc line. "Weir rope leaves tar on the hands and the soles both. It does not wash off easy." Two of the settlement men, at Bramwell's sharp command, seized Silas before he could run, and sure enough his boots and palms were black with the same tar that coated the shattered weir posts down on the tide flats. The truth came out fast after that, dragged from Silas's companions under the furious glare of both peoples. The whole sordid plan to break the treaty and seize the harbor for profit laid bare in the gray morning light. Chief Gorath, summoned from the clan camp, listened to it all with a face like carved stone, and when it was done he looked at Owen and Shagrol standing together at the boundary line, and something in his expression eased, just slightly. "The bond holds," he said, "because you two held it when lesser men would have let it break. Crane and his men will answer to your crown's law since it is your people's crime. But know this, wagon man," he fixed Owen with a hard look. "You stood between two armed peoples tonight with nothing but words. That took more courage than my champion's axes. I begin to understand why she could not deliver her threat to you." Shagrol's ears went faintly red at that, and Owen fought back a smile even in the wreckage of the night's near disaster. Silas Crane and his 4 conspirators were bound and marched east under guard 3 days later, to answer for their crimes before the garrison magistrate, and the settlement breathed easier for their absence, though the scandal of it, a settler plot to provoke war, uncovered by an orc woman's tracking eye and a wagon-master's nerve, was, for a long while afterward, all anyone along that stretch of coast could talk about. But it was what happened next, at the harbor market 3 weeks later, that truly became the story no one in Saltmere Cove would ever stop retelling. The market had grown since the treaty, orc traders coming down from the clan camp to sell smoked fish and carved bone tools alongside the settlers' woven goods and salvaged iron, an uneasy but real commerce blooming along the tide-flat stalls. Shagrol had taken to trading there herself some mornings, her fitted rust leathers a familiar sight now among the wool and homespun, though old wounds do not close so fast as treaties are signed, and there were still settlers who eyed her with suspicion, still orc traders who muttered about the champion who had let herself be claimed by a human. It was one of those settlers, a hard-faced woman named Prue Halloway, whose husband had been among Silas's conspirators, who finally let her grief and anger boil over in front of the whole crowded market. She threw a rotten fish head at Shagrol's feet, shouting that it was orc treachery that had gotten her husband dragged off in chains, that the whole cove had been cursed since the day a green-skinned devil was let to live among decent folk. And within moments the crowd had turned, ugly and fast, more rotten fruit and worse flying, voices rising, someone shoving Shagrol hard enough to stagger her back against a stall. Owen was 3 stalls away when it started, and he was running before he had fully registered what he was running toward, shoving through the crowd, and he arrived just as a settler man raised a gutting knife, more out of mob fury than real intent to kill, but real enough that Owen threw himself bodily between the blade and Shagrol without a heartbeat's hesitation, taking the shallow cut across his forearm instead of letting it find her. The crowd went dead silent. "Owen." Shagrol's voice cracked with something raw and furious and terrified all at once, and she caught him as he staggered, her hands fierce and careful on his bleeding arm. And then she turned on the crowd with a look that made grown men take 3 steps back without meaning to. "He bled for me," she said, and her voice carried over the whole silent market, harbor gulls wheeling overhead as if even they had stopped to listen. "A human man bled to keep a knife from an orc woman's back, in front of all of you, and still you call me the monster." She turned back to Owen, and whatever careful restraint had governed her public behavior for 3 months of careful, uncertain marriage burned away entirely in that moment. She caught his face in both hands, heedless of the blood on her fingers, and kissed him, hard and fierce and utterly unashamed, right there in the middle of the market with 200 settlers and traders and fishermen and orc kin all watching in open-mouthed silence. "He is mine," she said, breaking away just far enough to speak, loud enough for every soul in that market to hear, her hand still fisted in his shirt. "Mine by blood and bond and now by choice, and the next person who raises a blade near him answers to me, treaty or no treaty." She looked around at the stunned crowd, at Prue Holloway's shocked, pale face, at the settlers who had thrown rotten fish only moments before now staring at their boots. "I did not choose this bond when it was made. I choose it now. Let that be the tale you carry home tonight instead of lies about curses." No one moved for a long moment. Then from somewhere in the crowd, an old fisherman began slowly to clap, and others followed, uncertain at first and then with growing conviction, until the market rang with it, and Prue Holloway turned and fled through the crowd in tears, and Owen stood there bleeding and stunned and more thoroughly, hopelessly in love than he had ever imagined a man could be, staring at the fierce, magnificent woman who had just declared herself his in front of the entire settlement without a shred of hesitation. "You didn't have to do that," he said, once she dragged him to the healer's stall to have his arm properly bound, her hands still shaking slightly with leftover fury. "I did," Shagrol said. "I have spent 3 months telling myself this was only a treaty, Owen Morgan, only blood and duty. I am done telling myself lies." She looked at him and her fierce composure cracked entirely, something achingly vulnerable showing through. "You stepped between me and a blade without thinking. No one has ever done that for me. Not my kin, not my clan brothers in 100 battles. I did not know what to do with it except this." "I'd step in front of 100 blades for you," Owen said, low, meaning it with his whole chest, "and I'd count every one of them worth it." The story of the champion's kiss in the harbor market spread up and down the coast within days, told and retold in taverns and clan camps alike. And if there were still those who muttered about the strangeness of it, there were far more, Owen noticed, who had started to look at Shagrol and see, for the first time, not a monster among them but simply a woman fiercely, openly in love with her husband. And something about that public devotion did more to heal the rift between their peoples than any treaty ever could. Winter came hard to Saltmere Cove that year, gales screaming in off the Atlantic and driving spray clear over the new quay, and Owen and Shagrol weathered it together in the small timber house, the fire always lit, the bond between them grown into something neither of them had words for any more, something that had left treaty and duty so far behind that Owen sometimes woke in the gray mornings and simply lay still for a while, watching her sleep, marveling that this fierce, magnificent woman had chosen, again and again, to stay. It was not always easy. She still bristled at anything that smelled of pity or condescension from the settlers, still disappeared for hours at a time up the cliff road to sit with her clankin when the ache of old grief grew too sharp, still fought with Owen, sometimes fiercely, over small things, and large his stubborn refusal to rest when injured, her reckless habit of throwing herself into danger without thought for her own safety, the 100 small frictions of 2 strong-willed people learning to share a life. But every fight ended the same way, with one of them crossing the small distance of their timber house to find the other, with hands finding hands and foreheads pressed together, and low words of apology that were never really needed because the love beneath the friction had never once wavered. "You are the most stubborn man I have ever bound myself to," Shagrol told him one such night, after a fierce argument over whether Owen should have gone out alone to check the storm-battered docks. "You've only bound yourself to one man," Owen pointed out, "so I suppose I win by default." "That is exactly the sort of thing that makes me want to throw you into the harbor," Shagrol said, but she was laughing despite herself, and later that night, wrapped together against the howling wind outside, she pressed her lips to his shoulder and murmured, "I would throw myself in after you, though. Every time. Do not doubt that." By spring, the treaty between the Stonetide clan and Saltmere Cove had grown into something more than paper and blood oath. A real, working peace, orc traders and settler fishermen sharing the reef's bounty, children of both peoples. No, Owen corrected himself. Not children yet, but neighbors, friends, the first tentative threads of a shared community growing up together along the tide flats. Chief Goreth himself had softened toward Owen considerably, coming down from the clan camp on occasion to share a cup of the settlement's cider, which he pronounced, with the same grudging surprise Shagrol had once shown, not terrible. It was Goreth, in fact, who suggested the second ceremony. "The claim bond was law," he said to Owen one evening, "made in haste to stop a war. But my champion tells me she would choose you again freely without spear or treaty forcing her hand. There is an old rite for that too, wagon-man, if you are willing. A true joining, chosen and not bound. It is not required. The blood oath already holds." "I'll take any excuse to marry her twice," Owen said, and meant it entirely. They held the second ceremony at the very edge of the new quay, at the threshold between the settlement's timber walkway and the sea itself, where a simple driftwood arch had been raised and hung with dried kelp and wildflowers by Shagrol's own clan sisters, working alongside settler women who, a year before, would never have imagined sharing such labor. The whole of Saltmere Cove turned out, settlers and orcs both, crowding the black rocks and the new-built quay, gulls wheeling overhead in the bright spring sky, the tide coming in slow and silver beneath the last light of evening. Owen stood at one side of the driftwood threshold in his best coat, his heart hammering harder than it had the night of the spear at his throat, and watched Shagrol walk toward him along the quay in her familiar fitted rust-leather travel gear, cleaned and polished for the occasion, her black braid threaded through with pale spring flowers that some of the settler girls had woven for her that morning, laughing and teasing until she'd finally, grudgingly, let them fuss over her hair. She looked, Owen thought, like something out of an old tale, fierce and beautiful and entirely his, and he could not for the life of him remember why he had ever thought himself an ordinary man, a lonely wagon-master with nothing much to offer the world, because this extraordinary woman had looked at him across a threshold once already and chosen to stay. And now she was walking toward him a second time to choose him again, freely, before everyone who mattered to either of them. "Owen Morgan," Chief Goreth said, standing beside the driftwood arch, his voice carrying easily over the crowd and the crash of the tide below, "the first bond between you and my champion was forged in blood to buy peace. Do you now choose this woman freely of your own heart, wanting nothing from her but herself?" "I do," Owen said, and his voice did not shake at all. "I chose her the night she lowered her spear for a cup of cider, whether I knew it then or not. I choose her every day since. I'll go on choosing her until there's no more choosing left to do." Goreth turned to Shagrol. "And you, Shagrol Bonecrusher, champion of the Stonetide clan. Do you choose this man freely, wanting nothing from him but himself?" Shagrol looked at Owen, and there, before the whole gathered crowd of both their peoples, her fierce composure cracked entirely open, tears standing bright in her yellow eyes, though she did not try to hide them the way the old Shagrol, the champion who had ridden down the cliff road with a rehearsed threat, might once have done. "I came to this cove to frighten a wagon-master off land my people had bled for," she said, her voice carrying, raw and unguarded, over the silent crowd. "I had my speech ready, every word of it. And then he looked at me like I was a person worth being kind to instead of a monster to be feared, and he poured me a cup of cider, and I forgot every word I meant to say. A ripple of soft laughter moved through the crowd, warm and knowing, for the story of that first night had long since become legend along the whole coast. I have not found the words again since, not the ones I meant to say, but I have found better ones. I choose you, Owen Morgan. Not because of blood, not because of treaty, not because my chief commanded it. Because you are the bravest, kindest, most stubborn man I have ever known, and because you make me want to stay in one place for the first time in my life, and because I love you, fiercely and completely, and I mean to go on loving you until the tide stops coming in. Owen crossed the last few feet of the threshold and took both her hands in his, blood-scarred palm to blood-scarred palm, the same hands that had been bound together by Goreth's bone knife nearly a year before, though nothing about this moment felt like duty or treaty anymore. "Then let's make it official a second time," he said, "just so nobody along this whole coast can ever say we didn't mean it." He kissed her there at the threshold, with the sea crashing silver beneath the quay and the whole of Saltmere Cove human and orc alike, settlers who had once thrown rotten fish and warriors who had once raised spears, cheering loud enough to send the gulls scattering into the darkening sky, and Shagrol Bonecrusher, fierce champion of the Stonetide clan, wrapped her arms around her husband and kissed him back with everything she had, and did not let go for a long, long while. They walked back along the quay together as the first stars came out over the water, hand in hand, past the boundary stones that no longer marked a line of dispute, but simply the edge of a home they had built together, past the reef where orc nets and settler nets now hung side by side, drying in the evening wind. "No more rehearsed speeches," Owen said, as they reached the door of the timber house that had become, somewhere in the last year, simply home. "No," Shagrol agreed, pulling him close. "I find I much prefer the ones that come from the heart, wagon man, even if they make me lose every clever word I meant to say." "I'll take that trade every day for the rest of my life," Owen said, and she laughed, low and warm and utterly unguarded, and pulled him over the threshold and into the home and the life, and the love neither of them had ever thought to find on a wild, rugged coast, where an orc champion had once come to intimidate a wagon-master, and had lost far more than her opening line.